Good evening, and thank you for joining us for Griffins at Home. This evening, we have alumna Judy Telvacchia from the class of 1969 who will be leading us in spiritual direction. Judy is married Roman Catholic, and she's a lay ecclesial minister who lives outside of Boston, Massachusetts. She's a retired certified chaplain, a spiritual director, and a retreat director. Judy does formation work at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry as a facilitator for the Spiritual Formation for Ministry program and as an instructor for the Spiritual Direction Practicum. Judy is also an associate of the Sisters of the Holy Child Jesus. And with that, Judy, welcome and thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about spiritual direction because it's really a ministry of accompaniment. And with everything that's going on in the world today, certainly there are times I think when all of us need a listening ear. So before I talk about it, I just want to start with a quieting down and a little time just to settle from everything that we've been doing during the day before we begin. So let's just take a quiet moment. I'm going to read a poem that Gianna will put up on the screen for you called Deeply Listening. When someone deeply listens to you, it is like holding out a dented cup you have had since childhood and watching it fill up with cold, fresh water. When it balances on the top of the rim, you are understood. When it overflows and touches your skin, you are loved. When someone deeply listens to you, the room where you stay starts a new life. And the place where you wrote your first poem begins to blow in your mind's eye. It's as if gold has been discovered. When someone deeply listens to you, your bare feet are on the earth, and the beloved land that seemed distant is now at home within you. Amen. So I wanted to begin with an exercise about listening. I want you to think of a time when you really felt heard. What did the listener do that made you feel heard? And how did it make you feel? Think about how you felt physically, mentally, emotionally. I'll give you a minute just to think about that. Now think of a time when you didn't feel heard. What did the listener do that didn't make you feel heard? Or what did the listener not do? And how did that make you feel? Again, physically, mentally, emotionally. So you might want to share with each other some of the thoughts that came up. Some of the things that people say that have made them feel heard is when the listener makes eye contact, makes you feel like there's nothing more important that they have to do in that moment but listen to what you have to say. Sometimes they ask you questions or they reflect back what they've heard so that you know that they're paying attention. And that can often make you feel relaxed on every level. When you don't feel heard, often it's just the opposite. People seem distracted, like they're not really listening, they're not making eye contact, or you say something and they're talking about themselves. That can make you feel frustrated, angry, just low. I mean, God knows right at this point in time, with everything going on with the virus in our country, in the world, never mind what might be going on in your own lives. Everybody could use a time when they really feel heard. And that's really the essence of spiritual direction. So, what does it mean when I talk about spiritual direction? John is going to advance the slide. In essence, it's a meditative look at God's presence and action in one's life, where you, the person that come for spiritual direction, are heard. The focus for that hour is on you. And how many times does somebody focus on us exclusively for an hour? That in itself is a real gift. So, at its core, like I said, I can't say it enough. Spiritual direction is about listening. A director is listening to you, and together you're both listening to God, who's the real director. So keep this in the back of your mind, and we'll come back to this. So I want to just give you a little nuanced idea of spiritual direction. It's a ministry of listening, yes. It's particularly for people who are interested in an intentional journey of relationship with God, and usually their practice of prayer that helps them to connect with God. It's an ancient practice. Um, Even though we call it spiritual direction, it's really not directive. It's a process of being attentive to where God is in one's life, where God is leading us, and then how we're responding. So let me just give you a brief background about this, because I think for many people, they say, I've never heard of this. I don't know what this is all about. Well, it actually is an ancient practice. It began in the Celtic monasteries in Ireland in the 8th or 9th centuries, when the abbots and abbesses would offer spiritual counsel to the monks and nuns that lived in their abbeys. Eventually, these abbots and abbesses developed a reputation for holiness, and people from outside of the monastery came to them for counsel. Sometimes they would come to discuss the moral challenges in their lives. And so this kind of counsel took on a confessional tone, with abbots and abbesses functioning as informal confessors. Now, there still was confession, absolution with a priest, but there weren't that many priests. Um, so abbots and abbesses in the context of the monasteries often became informal confessors. They didn't give absolution, but people would talk to them about their moral challenges. When the sacraments were more clearly defined in about the 13th century, then spiritual counsel was often rolled into the practice of sacramental confession with a priest. So if somebody said, I have a regular confessor, that would mean they would go to a priest for confession, and in the context of confession, they would receive absolution, but they would also receive spiritual counsel. So the two were rolled into one. But St. Ignatius of Loyola in the 16th century, he had the insight that that spiritual accompaniment, separate from sacramental confession, was still a valuable practice. And he came up with this insight when he was still a layman, because he had some experiences that he couldn't understand that involved his experience of God. And he really needed some help to unpack it. And when he realized how valuable this was, he eventually wrote what we call the spiritual exercises, which are the foundation of what we call spiritual direction today. But there was a lot of resistance to that at his time. This was around the time of the Protestant Reformation, and any idea of people doing something outside of the official church, outside of mediation from the clergy, was suspect. And so Ignatius developed the spiritual exercises, but over time, even the Jesuits, for many reasons, lost the original inspiration of St. Ignatius of spiritual direction as one of accompaniment. Any of you who grew up in the pre-Vatican Church, you may remember that anytime you heard about a retreat, it was always a preached retreat, even if it was a Jesuit. So the Jesuit was preaching about his experience of the spiritual exercises, hoping that it would touch something in you. Now, the Second Vatican Council changed all that. All the religious orders were asked to go back and look at their original founding inspirations. And the Jesuits went back and looked and said, wait a minute, this preached retreats, that's the Dominicans. That's not what St. Ignatius intended for us to do. We should be accompanying people and helping them to focus on their relationship and their experience with God. So that model of spiritual direction was retrieved, and the Jesuits have been developing it and promoting it since the Second Vatican Council, and trying to make it more widely available to everybody, not just priests and religious, because they see the need for people to be heard and to be able to reflect on their spiritual lives. Now, there are other models of spiritual direction. The Eastern Church has the model of a spiritual father who is a teacher of the spiritual life. There are models where the director is a spiritual advisor, a guru, whose people go to because he or she has a particular expertise in an area of spirituality, or a spiritual friend where it's more of a mutual, almost like a faith sharing. But the Ignatian director, which is my training and what I like to promote, is not a teacher, not a guru, not a fixer, not a taskmaster, and not an entertainer. The Ignatian model is one of accompaniment. So, what brings a person to spiritual direction? Well, there are as many reasons as there are seekers, and there are many terms, I have to say. Sometimes the people coming are called seekers. The traditional term is directee, with the person accompanying being called a director. But there are many, many different reasons. Um, some common reasons are somebody wants an intentional relationship with God. They want to do more in their prayer life, be a little more deeply connected with God, or they're looking for guidance from God in particular aspects of their lives. There might be a life event that invites them to reflect about where's God in these circumstances, particularly in areas of suffering. Where was God? Why did God let this happen? There might be a desire for greater meaning in life, or a sense that there's more to life than what one is currently experiencing. Now, those of you from the Philadelphia area, you might have seen in the past St. Joseph's University had an advertising campaign where they had billboards that talked about the Magus. I remember being down visiting family and seeing that. This is a Latin word that St. Ignatius used that means the more. And St. Ignatius said, God is always inviting us to more. And we in this human life are never satisfied. There's always going to be more. So even if life is going really well, spiritual direction can be very helpful because we're always seeking more, and God is always inviting us to more. So, what's a spiritual director? Let's look at that for a moment. The spiritual director, first of all, is not someone who's there to tell you what to do. The spiritual director is a spiritual guide who accompanies a person of faith, we call the directee or the seeker, in a relationship that's focused on the spiritual growth of the directee. So the directee is the focus, not the director. There's a definition of spiritual director and that relationship that I love that was actually written by two Jewish spiritual directors. They said it's a relationship between two people of faith differing in competence, not authority. So the director is not there to tell the person what to do. The person is coming to the director because they see in them somebody that they think is more experienced in the spiritual life or has a knowledge of particular tools of the spiritual life that might be helpful to them. So the directors place their knowledge and experience of the spiritual life at the service of the seeker. They don't call attention to themselves. The focus is on the seeker or the directee. And together, the director and the directee listen for the promptings of God, who is the real director, who's the one who's guiding the person in the life of faith. To image this, some directors in their offices will put a third chair, an empty chair, to remind people that it's God that's the real director. So, what does the spiritual director do in a session? First and foremost, the director listens, listens, and listens some more. Everything the director says or does flows out of deep listening. Some of the things a director might do when they respond after they've heard you, they might affirm what you've said, they might summarize what they've heard, they might offer words of support, they might ask questions that invite you to explore further, to clarify, to unpack, or just to savor something wonderful that's happened. They might offer suggestions for prayer or reflection or ways of proceeding, but they're suggestions. You, the seeker, set the agenda. So, what do you talk about at spiritual direction? Your prayer, your faith, your questions, your life. Anything and everything is opened for you to talk about in spiritual direction. You can talk about your emotions, your hopes, your fears, your joys, your desires, your plans, your challenges, successes, failures, doubts, anything that you want to bring to the light of God, to let God's light inform and influence what you're thinking, feeling, experiencing. Some common faith issues that come up. What do I really believe about God? Who is God for me? And who am I before God? How does God relate to my family, my work, my life in the world? How can I become more aware of God's presence and action in my daily life? And how do I respond when I recognize God? How do I bring my faith into making a life decision? How do I draw on faith to cope with suffering, loss, or change? So, one very important thing to consider is, how is spiritual direction different from counseling therapy? Because this may sound a lot like counseling therapy. Generally, counseling focuses on problems in life and healthy resolutions. So it's problem focused, and you're trying to find specific strategies for resolving those problems. Okay. Spiritual direction is not about solving problems. Spiritual direction focuses on the presence of and action of God in the midst of life, in the midst of these problems. How can my faith, how can my spiritual resources come to bear on particular issues in my life? Sometimes people will do therapy and spiritual direction together. They find that they complement each other. Other people find that they have to do therapy maybe first to get a handle on particular problems before they can focus on where God is and all of that. So they're complementary, but they're distinct. The focus in spiritual direction is on, how does this affect my relationship with God, or how can my relationship with God be brought to bear on my life? So those are the basics of spiritual direction. And I wonder if it would be helpful to see an example of what a spiritual direction session might look like. You've heard a lot of words, but Jana and I are going to model for you just a short session to give you a sense of what it's like. So for this session, I'm going to call Jana Mary. Okay, just so you don't think that she and I are having a personal conversation about her own life. Okay. So hello, Mary. How are you this evening?
I'm very well. Looking forward to getting started.
That's great, Mary. So can you tell me a little bit about what you're hoping for in spiritual direction?
I guess just to be able to think about things a little more. I try to pray every day, but I get sidetracked a lot. I get distracted or preoccupied and just can't concentrate. There's so much going on in my life and in the world.
Well, I suspect you're in good company, Mary. There sure is a lot going on that makes it hard to settle down and concentrate. Can you tell me a little bit about how you pray?
Well, I have a book of daily Bible passages with questions and either a quote or a prayer from a religious leader.
And how long have you used this book?
About a year.
Mhm. So, what drew you to pray with Bible passages?
A friend of mine suggested it. She knew I wanted to do something more besides Mass each Sunday.
And what has that kind of prayer been like for you since you've been using the book?
At first, it was really good. I never studied the Bible, and I liked reading passages that I never heard before. The questions are really good, and I often lost track of time thinking about them. And I really liked the prayers too. Now I don't get much out of it.
Oh, you don't get much out of it.
No, it's like I read through the material for the day and then go on to my day. Sometimes later in the day, I can't even remember the passage was, the passage that I read that morning.
Yeah. So, when did this start to change?
Even before the pandemic and the other issues in our country, it just started to feel stale.
So, when you still enjoy praying with scripture, how did it bring you closer to God?
Well, I don't really know.
You don't know.
I didn't really think about God formally. I was so interested in the Bible passage and how it related to my life.
Uh huh. So, if you think back on it now, can you get a sense of God, what God was like when you were praying?
Well, I guess God was there, maybe looking over my shoulder as I read.
And what was God like as God looked over your shoulder?
I didn't really look at God. I guess it was comforting to have God reading with me, and a lot of the passages were comforting.
Huh. Are there other times when you feel God's comforting presence?
Now that you mention it, I like to listen to classical music, especially when I'm feeling agitated. It makes me feel calm and peaceful. It makes me feel comforted.
Like the feeling you had when you enjoyed praying with scripture, huh?
Yes, but even more so. Just thinking about God sitting, listening to quiet music with me is deeply comforting.
So I wonder if God is drawing you to music as a way of praying.
Maybe, but is that really prayer? It feels kind of funny doing something I enjoy and calling it prayer.
Now, how would you feel about trying it for a few days? You could intentionally invite God to listen with you, or you could just start listening and notice when and how God shows up.
I like that idea. It sounds too easy, but if you think this is prayer, I'll give it a try.
Good. So after you finish the music, maybe notice what God was like and what you were like as you listened together. And you can tell me about it next time we meet.
I think I'm going to enjoy this. Thank you.
So hopefully that gives you a sense of what might happen in a spiritual direction session and maybe let it feel a little less intimidating. So at this point, I don't know if you have any questions, comments, Jana.
I think this is wonderful. Thank you, Judy. I didn't have much information on spiritual direction beforehand, and so it's nice to know that there are opportunities to become more aware of one's faith and ways to be open to God, and that it's not just like going to confession, but it's different and it's greater, and that there are more opportunities to make those connections, not just one singular way.
Yeah. And I remember having attended the alumni session during the summer on emotional intelligence. And one of the things that Charmaine said was that self awareness is the most critical component of developing emotional intelligence, and that we have to ask for feedback because we all have blind spots. And I thought, spiritual direction is another way to help develop that kind of emotional intelligence, because we do have to look not just from a head perspective, but from a heart perspective. And it really does help us to become more self-aware. So there are a lot of potential benefits to spiritual direction for the person of faith. And I do have a handout too that Gianna's going to post about where to find a spiritual director if you're interested. Sometimes they can be a little difficult to find, especially well-trained spiritual directors. There's no certification for this, so technically anybody can hang out a shingle and say, I'm a spiritual director. But if you look at retreat houses, Catholic colleges or universities, they can be sources of referral. And there are two organizations that have referral services. One is run by the Jesuits of the USA East Coast province that will match you with Ignatian directors in your area. And the other is from Spiritual Directors International, which is a professional organization for spiritual directors worldwide. And they have a referral service as well that has Ignatian directors, Catholic directors, but also directors from other faith traditions and who practice other models of spiritual direction. So there are some resources that are expansive, that can give you a lead to people that might be helpful to you.
Well, thank you so much, Judy. This was wonderful. Thank you for sharing, spiritual direction with us, and for your expertise and providing opportunities for us to, kind of look a little farther beyond ourselves and to look into spiritual direction more. So thank you so much
My
for
pleasure.
being
Thank
with
you
us.
for having me.
And we will put up Judy's handout for anyone that's interested in looking up spiritual directors in the area. And thank you for joining us this evening for tonight's Griffins at Home. Our next session is January 28th with Gretel Schwartz, and she will be presenting on healthy life balance. So please feel free to join us just in time for the new year. And as we're setting new goals, come out and see what Gretel has to say. So thank you, everyone. Have a safe and healthy holiday season, and may God bless you in abundance. Thank you, Judy.